If you truly want to understand what this war is about, you have to look beyond the headlines and ignore the emotional framing that dominates most coverage, because the real story is written not in dramatic images, but in shifts that actually change conditions on the battlefield. Today, we're examining the Russia-Ukraine conflict through a strategic lens, focusing on what these developments reveal about Washington's calculations and the broader military-industrial system shaping this war. Over the weekend, thick black smoke rose over Crimea after a Ukrainian one-way drone struck an oil facility in Sebastopol, and almost immediately the questions began. Was this strike encouraged, or at least politically enabled, by recent statements from U.S. officials implying that Crimea was a legitimate target, or was it simply Ukraine's response to Russia's latest wave of missile attacks? The strike was carried out using what is commonly called a kamikaze drone, and it ignited a single oil storage tank. Crucially, the refinery itself remains operational. We don't know exactly how many drones were involved, but we do know the impact was limited. And this is where context matters. The fuel stored at this site is not directly linked to Russian ground operations inside Ukraine. It does not power armored advances or support air sorties along the front. That distinction is critical because from a military perspective, the attack had no meaningful operational impact. Destroying one tank does nothing to disrupt Russian logistics at scale. There are many other storage facilities, and operations continue uninterrupted. At best, this strike was symbolic, an action designed to be seen rather than felt. What truly matters, however, is not what burned on camera, but what unfolded quietly over the last 48 hours. Russia has clearly shifted its targeting priorities. For months, Russian forces focused heavily on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Then they pivoted towards systematically degrading Ukraine's air defenses. Ukraine never possessed a fully integrated air defense network comparable to Russia's, but whatever capability it did have has been steadily dismantled. The objective was straightforward: achieve air superiority. By most indicators, that goal has now been reached. And now we see the next phase emerging. Russian strikes are hitting an entirely new category of targets, signaling preparation for larger ground operations once terrain conditions allow. Over the past 2 days, Russian forces have targeted concentrations of ammunition, armored vehicles, and personnel. One of the most significant strikes hit a rail yard in Kramatorsk that Ukraine had converted into a major ammunition depot. Approximately 200 tons of munitions were stored there. That depot no longer exists. Given Ukraine's already strained supply situation, this represents a serious blow. Alongside that strike, Russian forces destroyed between 20 and 40 armored vehicles. Whether these vehicles were on rail cars or staged nearby remains unclear, but the destruction itself is confirmed. Even more consequential were strikes on 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters. Reports indicate that roughly 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. This is not about counting casualties for shock value. It's about understanding what those losses represent. Ukraine is running out of experienced officers with real operational competence. Many seasoned commanders were already lost earlier in the war. These strikes didn't just kill troops, they fractured command structures. Entire brigades lost leadership cohesion. There is also a strong possibility that NATO-aligned personnel were among the dead. British, American, or French advisors operating at increasingly tactical levels would not be unexpected, even if officially denied. Western involvement has steadily moved closer to the front lines, and that reality shapes the war regardless of how carefully it is framed in public. Meanwhile, across the Dnipro River near Kherson, Ukrainian forces had repositioned S-300 air defense systems, including launchers and tracking radars, supported by a Gepard anti-aircraft gun designed to counter low-flying aircraft and drones. All of it was destroyed. The radars, the launchers, the support systems, all gone. Without them, Ukraine cannot provide air cover for maneuvering forces in that area. From an operational standpoint, these strikes were devastatingly effective. This contrast defines the current moment. Media attention locks onto a dramatic fireball over Sebastopol, while the real battlefield story unfolds elsewhere. One makes for compelling footage. The other determines the course of the war. Understanding that difference is essential because when the focus remains on burning fuel tanks and dramatic visuals, it obscures what actually shapes outcomes on the ground. A single oil tank exploding makes for powerful television, but it does not shift the balance of power. That facility was not a critical node enabling Russian offensives. It wasn't supporting air operations or armored breakthroughs. It was, at most, auxiliary infrastructure, one tank among many, and the refinery continues to function. From a strategic perspective, this was theater symbolism presented as military action. And this pattern is familiar. Time and again, even the smallest Ukrainian action is inflated into a supposed turning point. If Russian forces withdraw from a village, often because holding it offers no tactical advantage, headlines quickly declare another Ukrainian victory. But in flat terrain dotted with settlements of limited strategic value, these micro-adjustments mean very little. They are frequently part of deliberate repositioning, not signs of collapse. The narrative, however, rarely reflects that reality. The real story lies in Russia's targeting precision and intelligence advantage. Russian forces have demonstrated detailed knowledge of where Ukrainian brigade headquarters were located. That level of accuracy does not happen by chance. It reflects deep intelligence penetration. While the United States and its allies provide Ukraine with high-quality intelligence, including satellite imagery, signal intercepts, and surveillance data, the results have been uneven. Ukraine recently managed to strike a Russian brigade headquarters, but compare that outcome to what happened on the other side. 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters destroyed, over 1,000 casualties. 1 Russian headquarters targeted. The imbalance is striking. This is not simply about access to information. It's about the ability to act on it. Intelligence alone does not win wars. It has to be converted into coordinated action supported by logistics, training, and experienced leadership. That is where Ukraine continues to struggle. The leaked Pentagon documents offered a glimpse into just how severe this imbalance may be, suggesting casualty ratios of 1 Russian loss for every 7 or even 9 Ukrainian losses. If those figures are even remotely accurate, Ukraine is being systematically hollowed out from the inside. Attrition on that scale is not something any force can sustain indefinitely, especially when already facing shortages in manpower, equipment, and experienced leadership. And this is where attempts to directly link battlefield developments to statements made by U.S. officials, particularly figures like Victoria Nuland, move from analysis into political theater. She is not issuing orders from a command bunker, and she does not wear a Ukrainian uniform. But dismissing her influence entirely would be naive. For years, she has been a central figure shaping U.S. policy toward Ukraine. Her role in steering both Kyiv and Washington toward deeper confrontation with Russia is undeniable. Whether or not she intended any specific strike, she belongs to the leadership class that owns the trajectory of this war, and that responsibility cannot be easily separated from outcomes on the ground. There is another development that has received remarkably little attention in Western media. Around the 1-year mark of the conflict, Russia reportedly deployed a hypersonic missile, possibly a Kinzhal, in a strike that may have hit a NATO-linked underground facility. Reports pointed to significant casualties, yet coverage has been minimal. Verification has been difficult. Some sources placed the strike near Kyiv, which aligns more closely with known Russian targeting patterns, while others claimed it occurred near Lviv. What we do know is that there have been no publicly acknowledged returns of American casualties. That silence does not rule out discrete repatriation. In fact, the silence itself raises questions. Media silence is rarely accidental. Narratives are carefully maintained, and reports of NATO casualties inside Ukraine do not fit comfortably within the story being told to Western audiences. The broader reality, however, is becoming harder to ignore. Ukraine is losing this war. That assessment does not come solely from Moscow-aligned voices. Senior military figures in neighboring NATO countries are now saying it openly. Poland's chief of staff has repeatedly stated that Poland no longer has the ammunition reserves to sustain even a short conflict with Russia, largely because its stockpiles have been drained by support for Ukraine. More importantly, he has rejected the caricature of the Russian military as incompetent and disorganized. Instead, he describes Russian forces as capable, disciplined, and resilient. That assessment clashes sharply with the image often presented in Western media of poorly trained soldiers and failing command structures. Reality, as it often does, is more complex and far less comforting. At the same time, figures like Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, further complicate the picture. His public statements are provocative and often disruptive, but they also suggest personal political ambition. He appears to be positioning himself for a post-war role within Russia's political landscape. His rhetoric may be less about battlefield truth and more about self-promotion. Yet President Putin's tolerance of these outbursts likely serves a purpose. Prigozhin's criticism applies pressure to conventional military commanders without Putin needing to intervene directly. It is a way to apply internal force while maintaining plausible distance. All of this points to a system under strain, but not one in collapse, and that distinction matters as the war enters its next phase. President Putin's own actions reinforce this interpretation. His visits to frontline areas in the south and near Belarus are not simply symbolic photo opportunities. They are strategic signals. He wants major operations ready to begin as soon as the ground hardens and large-scale movement becomes possible again. When Prigozhin publicly complains that neighboring units are advancing too slowly, it is easy to imagine that his frustration aligns with pressure coming from the top. In that sense, Prigozhin functions as a useful irritant, pushing the system forward without Putin needing to issue public reprimands within Russia's military command. There has also been a notable shakeup within the Russian military structure. The chief of logistics was recently dismissed after the FSB reportedly uncovered corruption involving stolen engines from the T-14 Armata tank program. Corruption in Russia is not a new phenomenon, but the timing of this removal is revealing. It suggests the Kremlin was already aware of the issue and chose this moment to act, likely under growing pressure from Putin and Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. This was not panic. It was correction. Western observers often interpret the removal or death of senior officers as evidence of instability. In Russian military culture, the reaction is often the opposite. When generals are dismissed, it signals accountability. When they are wounded or killed near the front, it reinforces the idea that leadership shares risk with the troops. That dynamic tends to build loyalty rather than undermine it. Over the past 14 to 15 months, Russia has removed a number of senior officers. These actions are not signs of collapse. They reflect adaptation under pressure. This pattern reveals something deeper about how Russia manages prolonged conflict. Removing ineffective leadership reinforces the perception that the system is responsive and controlled. It sends a clear internal message that incompetence will not be tolerated, even during a war of attrition. Externally, it projects the image of a state actively managing the conflict rather than drifting aimlessly. Whether one agrees with Moscow's objectives or not, this approach has helped maintain cohesion as the war grinds on. A recent video circulating online illustrates another widely misunderstood aspect of this war. It shows a Wagner Group armored personnel carrier attempting to move through deep mud near Bakhmut. The vehicle struggles through thick, waterlogged terrain that appears almost impassable. To many Western viewers, the footage reinforces the idea of Russian dysfunction, but that interpretation misses the point. The mud affects everyone equally. It halts Russian advances and Ukrainian counterattacks alike. Nature is impartial. This terrain has delayed the next major phase of the war for both sides. Despite these constraints, the pace of escalation continues, and that reality sets the stage for what comes next. Within the past week, Russia launched missile strikes on Kramatorsk that reportedly killed 26 people, and in response, Ukrainian military leaders declared their intention to escalate attacks on Moscow. That statement immediately raises a crucial question. Do they mean Moscow itself, the capital, or are they using the word Moscow as shorthand for Russian territory and military assets more broadly? The distinction matters because Russia's border stretches for roughly 1,000 miles, and defending such a vast frontier against infiltration or covert action is inherently difficult. Ukrainians and Russians are often ethnically and linguistically similar, and many Ukrainians speak fluent Russian with only subtle regional accents. That reality makes infiltration possible. The question is not whether it can be done, but what it would actually achieve. Suppose Ukraine manages to carry out a limited strike inside Moscow, perhaps a symbolic attack, a small explosion, or a damaged building. What would that accomplish from a strategic standpoint? It would almost certainly harden Russian resolve, justify retaliation, and accelerate escalation. From a military cost-benefit perspective, the gains are questionable at best. Symbolic actions rarely compensate for material losses on the battlefield. This brings us to a deeply troubling debate now unfolding in Washington. Some U.S. lawmakers have begun advocating for sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. This proposal reflects a profound misunderstanding of both warfare and its long-term consequences. Cluster munitions are not precision weapons. They are designed to saturate large areas with small explosives, dispersing hundreds or even thousands of submunitions across wide zones. The danger does not end when the fighting stops. Between 10 and 15% of these submunitions fail to detonate, remaining in the ground as de facto landmines. The United States has direct experience with this. During the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991, U.S. forces used cluster munitions extensively. After the war, unexploded bomblets killed and maimed soldiers and civilians alike, and children were among the most frequent victims. Sending these weapons into Ukraine would leave a lethal legacy that lasts for decades. The humanitarian cost would far outlive the conflict itself. Framing this as a solution exposes how detached policymaking has become from human reality, and as the war drags on, that detachment grows more dangerous rather than less. The discussion around escalation cannot be separated from the reality of attrition, and this is where the numbers become impossible to ignore. Estimates now suggest that Ukraine has lost more than 10,000 armored fighting vehicles since the war began. That figure alone should force a pause. Armored vehicles are not easily replaced, especially for a country whose industrial base has been degraded and whose supply chains depend almost entirely on external support. The obvious question is what Ukraine has gained in exchange for such losses. Territorial changes have been minimal and often temporary. Politically, the country is more dependent than ever. Strategically, its position has deteriorated. From Moscow's perspective, this confirms that their approach is working. Attrition favors the side with greater industrial depth, manpower reserves, and internal cohesion. From Washington's perspective, continued aid can create the illusion of momentum, but in practice it feeds a cycle that drains Ukrainian capacity far faster than Russian capability. Each destroyed vehicle becomes justification for sending more. Each shipment becomes another line item in defense contracts. For the American military-industrial complex, this war is profitable. For Ukraine, it is devastating. This contradiction was laid bare during recent congressional testimony by General Mark Milley. When asked why he remained confident that Ukraine could still win, he pointed to Russian losses in armored vehicles. On the surface, the answer sounded reassuring. But when placed alongside the reality that Ukraine has lost more than 10,000 armored vehicles, while Russia has not suffered comparable losses, the logic collapses. Confidence without alignment to facts becomes performance rather than analysis. In contrast, General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's supreme allied commander in Europe, offered a far more revealing assessment. He acknowledged that there is little concrete evidence to suggest Russia's armed forces have been severely degraded by the war. Having said that, he quickly shifted the conversation toward naval and submarine warfare, likely to avoid dwelling on uncomfortable truths. But the message was clear. The image of a crippled Russian military does not match observable reality. This marks a subtle but important shift. More officials are beginning to introduce inconvenient facts into public discourse, often indirectly. They understand that credibility requires at least some acknowledgement of realities that no longer fit the established narrative. The uncomfortable truth is that this war was never only about defending Ukrainian sovereignty. It was also intended to weaken Russia so decisively that it would no longer project power beyond its borders. That objective has failed. Russia has absorbed the pressure, adapted its tactics, and in many areas improved its operational effectiveness. At the same time, Western leaders are quietly signaling that Ukraine's prospects are grim. Through anonymous leaks rather than official statements, the tone is changing. A recent report suggested that President Zelensky has been presented with an ultimatum: launch a counteroffensive, or begin negotiations that include territorial concessions. If accurate, this presents him with an impossible choice. A major offensive under current conditions would likely result in catastrophic losses. Negotiations, on the other hand, would be framed as betrayal. That is not strategy. It is abandonment disguised as agency. Former CIA analyst Ray McGovern put this dynamic bluntly when he predicted that Zelensky would not remain in power another year, not because of direct Russian action, but because he would be removed by NATO interests or by Ukrainian nationalist forces themselves. In his view, Putin would not need to intervene at all. Zelensky's fate would be decided by those who once backed him or by those who believe he failed to go far enough. When you examine Zelensky's political rise, the pattern is familiar. Like many Western-backed leaders, he was elevated rapidly, packaged as a symbol, and presented as a solution. Before politics, he was an entertainer, a performer whose appeal was rooted in media presence and populist charm. He was supported by powerful oligarchic interests and ran on a platform centered on peace, especially ending the conflict in Donbass. Crucially, he was a native Russian speaker, signaling reconciliation to a divided electorate. Once in office, that platform disappeared. Peace was replaced by hardline nationalism fully aligned with Western strategic objectives. Whether this shift was voluntary or imposed remains open to debate, but the outcome is what matters. Voters' expectations were discarded, and the country was drawn deeper into a war it was structurally unprepared to sustain. As pressure continues to mount, Zelensky's political survival grows increasingly uncertain, and with it the stability of Ukraine's governing system. This instability is not just about one individual leader. It reflects a broader pattern seen in governments that come to be perceived as serving external agendas over the needs of their own populations. When that perception hardens, legitimacy erodes quickly. Whether Zelensky is eventually pushed out through political maneuvering, forced into exile, or removed through more extreme means, the underlying tension will remain. The deeper issue is trust, and once that is lost, no amount of foreign backing can fully restore it. This is a lesson repeated throughout modern history, yet it is rarely acknowledged in real time. That brings us to a much larger question that extends beyond Ukraine itself, the future of NATO. For years, NATO has presented itself as a unified and indispensable alliance, but this war has exposed fractures that were already present. You have argued before that the conflict in Ukraine could either fracture NATO or leave it fundamentally altered, and the evidence suggests that process is already underway. A revealing moment came during French President Emmanuel Macron's recent meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, when Macron publicly stated that France would not automatically follow the United States into a war with China over Taiwan. This was not a minor diplomatic aside. It was a direct challenge to the assumption that NATO members will align unquestioningly with Washington on every major strategic issue. By saying this openly, Macron punctured the illusion of consensus. What followed was equally telling. Poland, long regarded as one of NATO's most hawkish members and a firm supporter of U.S. leadership, suggested that Macron might have a point. The implication was subtle but significant. Perhaps Europe has relied too heavily on the United States for its security, and perhaps that dependence has gone too far. These are not marginal voices. They come from core members of the alliance. This debate is not new. During Donald Trump's presidency, he bluntly told European leaders to stop relying on American military power and start funding their own defense. His language was abrasive, but the argument itself was straightforward. Why should American taxpayers underwrite European security indefinitely? European leaders objected to the tone, but few challenged the substance. Angela Merkel even hinted that Europe might need to chart a more independent path, yet in practice, little changed. Defense spending remained low, and dependence on the United States continued. From a purely rational standpoint, that behavior makes sense. If a powerful ally guarantees your security regardless of your own investment, there is little incentive to spend more. It may be strategically short-sighted, but it is economically convenient. The problem is that this arrangement leaves Europe strategically immature. Real autonomy requires real responsibility, And the only way that changes is if the guarantee weakens or disappears. Remove the assumption that the United States will always step in and European nations will be forced to adapt. That adaptation will not be smooth or quick, but it will be unavoidable. Without it, NATO risks becoming an alliance in name only, a collection of flags and institutions without a coherent purpose or shared resolve. So, will NATO survive? Possibly. But survival does not necessarily mean relevance. The alliance may continue to exist on paper while losing its ability to function as a unified military force. This war has accelerated that trajectory. It has revealed that European interests do not always align neatly with Washington's priorities, and it has shown that hostility toward Russia has often been assumed rather than carefully examined. A future European security architecture may look very different. It would not necessarily be anti-American, but it would no longer be dictated by Washington.